The thermometer outside Tormod Bjornsson's cabin read -62 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in 90 seconds, yet his two young children slept peacefully in their bedrolls, while his neighbors huddled around dying fires in cabins that had become death traps. Tormod's family rested comfortably in a space those same neighbors had mocked him for building all summer long. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. Eric Solberg died 20 yards from safety on the morning of February 3, 1880. Tormod Bjornsson found him 3 hours after sunrise, lying face down in snow that had drifted against the root cellar door during the night. The temperature had dropped to -40 degrees during the darkness, and Eric had left the cabin he shared with Tormod to retrieve preserved meat for breakfast. He never made it back. The distance from cabin door to root cellar entrance was 43 steps in summer. In winter, with snow and brutal cold, it became a deadly journey. Tormod had awakened to find Eric's bedroll empty and the cabin door unlatched. He dressed quickly, wrapping himself in every layer he owned, and went searching. The wind had stopped, leaving the Dakota Territory landscape perfectly still, under a sky so clear it hurt to look at. His breath froze in his beard before he exhaled completely. He found Eric's tracks leading toward the root cellar, a wandering line in the snow that showed how the cold had already been affecting his partner's judgment. Eric had made it to within 20 yards of the cellar door before he fell. Tormod could see where his friend had stumbled, tried to rise, stumbled again. The final 10 feet showed drag marks where Eric had attempted to crawl. Then nothing. Just a body-shaped mound of snow that Tormod had to brush away to confirm what he already knew. They had been partners for 3 years, working adjacent homestead claims and sharing labor during harvest and construction. Eric was 42 years old, strong as an ox, experienced in cold weather. He had emigrated from the Trondheim region of Norway, where winters were harsh, but nothing like the extremes of the Dakota plains. The cold here was different, Tormod thought as he knelt beside his friend's frozen body. It was absolute. It was merciless. And it killed with efficiency that left no room for mistakes. Tormod managed to move Eric's body to the cabin. The corpse was rigid, frozen in the position it had died in. He laid his partner on the floor and sat beside him for an hour, unable to process what had happened. 43 steps, less than a minute's walk in normal conditions. Eric had died trying to get food that would have kept them fed for 2 days. The funeral took place 4 days later when the cold broke enough to dig a grave. Reverend Amundsen spoke briefly about the dangers of frontier life and the importance of accepting God's will. Gunnar Holt and Matthias Dietrich helped lower Eirik into the frozen ground on a hillside overlooking both homesteads. Sigrid Bjornsson stood with Tormod, holding their daughter Kari's hand while young Nils pressed against his father's leg. 16 people attended. Every one of them understood that Eric's death was tragic but not unusual. Men died on the frontier. Cold, killed as efficiently as accidents, disease, or violence. But Tormod couldn't accept it as inevitable. That night, lying awake in his cabin while his family slept, he thought about the distance between shelter and survival. 43 steps had killed his partner. Tormod had grown up in Finnmark, Norway's northernmost county, where winter darkness lasted 2 months and temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees. His childhood home sat 3 miles from the Arctic Ocean, in a region where survival wasn't about toughness, but about intelligent preparation. The Bjornsson family had occupied the same land for 6 generations, and each generation had refined the techniques that kept them alive through conditions that killed unprepared newcomers. His father, Jakob Bjornsson, had taught him about jordhus systems before Tormod was old enough to help build them. A jordhus wasn't simply a root cellar. It was an integrated underground network that connected living spaces to storage areas, animal shelters, and sometimes to neighboring farms. The concept was simple but required understanding principles that most people never considered. Earth below the frost line maintained constant temperature regardless of surface conditions. In Finnmark, the frost line was 8 feet deep. Below that depth, the ground stayed between 45 and 50 degrees year-round. Tormod remembered helping his father excavate a connecting passage when he was 12 years old. Their neighbors, the Hansen family, lived a quarter-mile away across open tundra. During severe storms, traveling that distance was impossible. Children had frozen to death making such journeys. So the two families dug a passage connecting their Jordhus systems, creating a tunnel that allowed safe movement regardless of surface weather. The excavation took 3 months during the summer of 1859. The men dug carefully, shoring the tunnel with timber every 6 feet. They lined the walls with stones fitted tightly enough to prevent soil collapse. The ceiling required special attention. Jacob insisted on a 3-layer system: structural beams, then planks laid perpendicular to seal gaps, then earth packed above for insulation. Young Tormod hadn't understood why planks were necessary until his father explained that gaps between beams would allow heat loss and soil infiltration. The tunnel was 5 feet high, 3 feet wide, and extended 400 feet between the two farms. It took considerable labor and resources, and other families in the area thought the Bjornsons and Hansens were wasting effort on unnecessary construction. Then came the winter of 1860, when a storm lasted 11 days with winds strong enough to tear roofs from buildings. Surface travel was impossible. The temperature dropped to -45 degrees with wind chill far below that. The Bjornson and Hansen families visited each other daily through the tunnel. They shared food, combined their labor for necessary tasks, and kept morale high through social contact. 3 other families in the region, isolated in their individual farms, suffered catastrophically. 2 children died. Adults developed frostbite. Livestock froze in their shelters. When the storm finally broke, those families looked at the Jordhus tunnel with different eyes. Tormod was 21 when he left Norway for America. His father's final advice had been simple: remember that cold kills quickly but stupidly. Intelligence and preparation defeat it every time. Now, lying in his Dakota cabin after burying Eric, those words returned with urgent clarity. He had the knowledge. He had the skills. What he needed was the will to endure the mockery that would inevitably come from building something his American neighbors wouldn't understand. Tormod began digging on March 7, 1880, as soon as the ground thawed enough to work. He started inside his cabin against the north wall, the side closest to his root cellar. The cellar sat 38 feet from the cabin, buried 6 feet deep into a slight rise in the terrain. It was a standard frontier root cellar, 8 feet square with a timber roof covered in sod. The entrance was a slanted door that opened upward, requiring anyone entering to descend crude steps cut into earth. His plan was straightforward. He would excavate a tunnel from his cabin floor descending at a gentle angle until he reached depth, then continuing horizontally to intersect with the root cellar. The tunnel would be 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, dimensions that allowed comfortable passage while minimizing excavation volume. The total length would be approximately 50 feet, accounting for the angled descent and horizontal distance. He removed floorboards from a 6-foot section of his cabin, exposing the dirt beneath. Sigrid watched without commenting as he marked the tunnel entrance dimensions with stakes and cord. Kari and Niels treated it as entertainment, their father beginning a mysterious project that involved digging a hole inside their house. Tormod said little about his intentions. He simply began removing earth, 1 shovelful at a time. The first day's work created a pit 4 feet deep. He hauled the excavated soil outside, spreading it in areas where he planned to expand his garden. By the second day, neighbors noticed the activity. Gunnar Holt stopped by on the 3rd day, curious about what Tormod was doing. "Expanding the cellar?" Gunnar asked, peering into the hut. "Growing excavation." "Making a passage," Tormod replied, his Norwegian accent still heavy despite 3 years in America. "Connect cabin to cellar." Gunnar stared at him. "You're digging a tunnel?" To walk 30 feet? 38 feet, Tormod corrected. And yes, why not just walk outside like a normal person? Tormod paused his digging and looked directly at Gunnar. Eric walked outside. Eric died. The statement created uncomfortable silence. Gunnar shifted his weight, glanced at the excavation, then back at Tormod. That was bad luck. Terrible cold. But you can't dig tunnels every time the weather turns harsh. That's not practical. In Norway, we dig tunnels, Tormod said simply, returning to his work. Gunnar left, shaking his head. By evening, word had spread through the scattered settlement. The Norwegian was digging a tunnel from his cabin to his root cellar. Matthias Dietrich rode over the next day to see for himself. He stood at the cabin entrance, watching Tormod work 6 feet below floor level, excavating earth and placing it in buckets that Sigrid hauled up with a rope. "This is madness," Matthias said in his German-accented English. "You'll spend all summer digging. For what? To avoid walking outside?" "To stay alive when winter comes," Tormod answered. "We all survived last winter. Eric didn't." Matthias had no response to that. He left. But Tormod heard him talking to Gunnar outside, their voices carrying through the cabin walls. Words like obsessed and waste of time and Norwegian foolishness filtered through. Tormod kept digging. By the end of March, Tormod had excavated 15 feet of descending tunnel. The passage angled downward at a ratio of 1 foot of depth for every 6 feet of horizontal distance, a gentle slope that would be easy to navigate while ensuring he reached below the frost line. He worked methodically, refusing to rush despite the enormous volume of earth that needed moving. Every 2 feet of progress required removing approximately 30 cubic feet of soil, all of it hauled up in buckets and carried outside. The excavation technique he used came directly from his father's teaching. Rather than simply digging forward and hoping the tunnel wouldn't collapse, Tormod excavated in sections. He would dig ahead 3 feet, creating an unsupported span. Then he would install shoring before continuing. The shoring consisted of vertical timber posts on each side of the tunnel, connected by horizontal crossbeams at the top. Each frame was constructed from pine logs he cut and shaped specifically for this purpose. The timber frames were placed every 3 feet along the tunnel length. He notched the vertical posts into the tunnel floor, digging small pockets that the posts sat in, preventing them from shifting. The horizontal crossbeams were notched to fit over the vertical posts, creating a rigid frame. He used wooden pegs driven through drilled holes to lock the joints. The result was a series of rectangular frames that held back the earth and prevented collapse. Between the frames, Tormod installed planks along the tunnel walls. These weren't strictly necessary for structural support, but they served 2 important purposes. First, they prevented loose soil from continually falling into the passage. Second, they created a smoother surface that made movement easier and gave the tunnel a more finished appearance. He fitted the planks carefully, cutting them to match the curve where walls met ceiling, creating a rounded profile that was structurally stronger than sharp corners. The excavated earth told a story about the land he lived on. The first 3 feet consisted of dark topsoil, rich with organic matter. Below that came a layer of clay, dense and heavy, difficult to dig but excellent for stability. At 8 feet depth, he encountered sandy soil mixed with small stones. This concerned him initially, but the clay layer above provided enough stability that the sandy layer didn't threaten collapse. Sigrid helped when she could, hauling buckets while Tormod dug. Kari and Niels were forbidden from entering the excavation, but they played at the tunnel entrance, fascinated by the growing hole that extended deeper into the earth. Neighbors continued visiting, ostensibly to help with other tasks, but really to see the tunnel's progress and offer their opinions. Gunnar Holt remained the most vocal critic. "You've moved enough earth to dig 3 root cellars," he observed during one visit. "All this work to avoid putting on a coat. All this work to stay alive," Tormod corrected, not pausing in his digging. Reverend Amundsen visited in early April and offered a different perspective. "I admire your dedication, Tormod, But I wonder if this focus on preparation suggests a lack of faith in providence. Tormod straightened, leaning on his shovel. In Norway, we say God helps those who dig their own tunnels. Perhaps I say it wrong in English, but the meaning is clear. The Reverend smiled slightly. The saying is, God helps those who help themselves, but I understand your meaning. By mid-April, Tormod had reached his target depth of 8 feet and begun the horizontal section of the tunnel. The passage now extended 25 feet from his cabin, with another 25 feet remaining before it would intersect with his root cellar. He had maintained consistent dimensions throughout, 5 feet high, 3 feet wide, with timber frames every 3 feet and planked walls creating smooth surfaces. The work was progressing exactly as he had planned, but the most critical phase was beginning. The ceiling construction would determine whether his tunnel lasted 1 year or 30 years. In the descending section, he had used simple crossbeams spanning the width of the tunnel, supported by the vertical posts of his timber frames. This was adequate for a sloped passage where earth pressure was distributed naturally. But the horizontal section presented different challenges. Here, the full weight of 8 feet of earth pressed directly downward. Tormod began implementing the 3-layer ceiling system his father had taught him. The first layer consisted of his primary structural beams, pine logs roughly 6 inches in diameter, notched to rest securely on the vertical posts of each timber frame. He spaced these beams 12 inches apart, close enough to provide robust support. Each beam was carefully selected for straightness and absence of rot or significant knots. The second layer was where neighbors began questioning his sanity. Across the structural beams, Tormod laid planks perpendicular to the beam direction. These were boards he had laboriously sawn from larger logs using a pit saw. Each plank was approximately 1 inch thick and 8 inches wide. He fitted them tightly together, leaving minimal gaps. Matthias Dietrich arrived while Tormod was installing planks. He watched for several minutes before speaking. "You're putting a floor above your head. That's expensive lumber, Tormod. I could build a chicken coop with what you're nailing up there." "Not nailing," Tormod corrected. "The planks rest on beams. Their weight holds them in place." "Even worse. You're wasting good wood where no one will see it." "Without planks, soil falls through beam gaps. With planks, the ceiling is solid," Tormod explained. Gunnar Holt, who had accompanied Matthias, gestured at the partially completed ceiling. "You've used enough lumber for a small cabin just on this tunnel roof. And for what? To keep a little dirt from falling on your head?" "To keep 8 feet of earth from collapsing into the passage," Tormod replied. "And to maintain temperature stability. Gaps lose heat." The two men exchanged glances that conveyed their shared opinion. Tormod was obsessed beyond reason. They left him to his work, but their conversation was audible as they walked back toward their horses. Gunnar's voice carried clearly. "He'll regret this waste come summer when he needs lumber for repairs." The third layer completed the ceiling system. Over the planks, Tormod packed earth, creating a layer approximately 18 inches thick. This wasn't simply thrown dirt. He mixed clay-rich soil with the sandy earth, creating a composite that would pack firmly and shed water. The earth layer served multiple purposes. It added thermal mass for temperature stability, it distributed weight across the plank layer, and it created a buffer between the passage and surface conditions. The result was a ceiling that could support substantial weight while maintaining the thermal properties essential to his design. Sunday services at Reverend Amundson's cabin brought the scattered settlement together each week. Families traveled from homesteads spread across 5 miles of Dakota prairie, gathering for worship and social contact that sustained them through the isolation of frontier life. On the 3rd Sunday of April 1880, Tormod arrived, with Sigrid, Carrie, and Niels, to find himself the subject of considerable attention. Gunnar Holt was holding court near the cabin entrance, entertaining a group of men with his description of Tormod's tunnel project. 8 weeks of digging, and he's still not finished, Gunnar was saying as Tormod approached. He's moving enough earth to plant an entire wheat field, all so he doesn't have to walk 30 paces in cold weather. Several men chuckled. Thomas McCarty, an Irish settler who had arrived the previous year, shook his head in disbelief. In County Cork, we'd call that madness. A man digs a cellar, puts a door on it, and that's that. This Norwegian is building underground rooms like he's some kind of mole. Tormod heard the comments but said nothing. He guided his family toward the cabin entrance, acknowledging greetings from those who offered them. Sigrid kept her eyes forward, her hand tight on Kari's shoulder. Inside the cabin, families arranged themselves on benches and the floor for the service. Reverend Amundsen led them through hymns and prayers, then delivered a sermon about trusting in God's provision rather than worldly preparations. Tormod wondered if the sermon's theme was directed at him specifically. After the service, several people approached with questions framed as concern. Friedrich Weiss asked how the tunnel was progressing, though his tone suggested he was gathering material for future stories. Catherine Holt made a pointed comment to Sigrid about how difficult it must be to live with all that dirt being tracked through the cabin. The children were less subtle. A boy named Patrick McCarty, perhaps 9 years old, approached Carrie during the social time. "My da says your family's going to live underground like badgers," he announced loudly enough for nearby adults to hear. "Says your pa's afraid of a little cold." Kari, 6 years old and fiercely loyal to her father, responded before thinking. "My pa's not afraid of anything. Your da doesn't know about Norwegian tunnels." "Norwegian tunnels," Patrick repeated mockingly. "That's stupid. Tunnels are for mines, not houses." Tormod intervened before the confrontation escalated, placing his hand gently on Kari's shoulder and guiding her away. But the exchange had been witnessed by a dozen people, and the story would spread. His daughter was now defending his project against mockery from other children. On the ride home, Sigrid finally spoke about what she had been holding inside. "They think you're foolish." "I know," Tormod replied, guiding their wagon along the rutted trail. "They think we're foolish by association." "I know that too. Does it bother you?" Tormod considered the question while watching the prairie grass bend under a spring wind. "Eric is dead because 43 steps was too far in cold weather. If they think I'm foolish for making sure that never happens to my family, then they can think what they want." Sigrid nodded slowly. "I trust you, but it's hard." To hear them laughing. "Let them laugh now," Tormod said quietly. "Winter comes for everyone equally." The walls of Tormod's tunnel required as much attention as the ceiling, though the work was less visible to casual observers. As he excavated the horizontal section approaching his root cellar, he simultaneously refined the walls behind him, transforming crude earth surfaces into engineered structures that would last decades. The process was meticulous and time-consuming, but Tormod understood that shortcuts in wall construction would lead to long-term failure. He began by selecting stones from the creek bed half a mile from his homestead. The stones needed specific characteristics: relatively flat surfaces, dense composition without cracks, and sizes that could be handled by one man. He rejected rounded river rocks in favor of angular stones that would lock together more effectively. Each stone was carried back to the tunnel individually, a process that required dozens of trips over several weeks. The wall construction followed a pattern similar to dry stone masonry, though Tormod added a critical element that most frontier settlers ignored. He mixed clay from the lower excavation layers with water and a small amount of lime he had purchased during his last trip to the territorial capital. The lime made the clay mixture more adhesive and water-resistant. The resulting mortar wasn't as strong as proper cement, but it was vastly superior to unmortared stone or simple mud. Starting at the tunnel floor, he laid stones in courses, each stone carefully positioned to bridge the joints in the course below. He worked from both sides simultaneously, building the walls inward until they met the timber planking he had previously installed. The mortar was packed between stones and behind them, filling gaps and bonding the stone wall to the earthen surface behind it. Each course needed to dry partially before the next could be added, slowing the work but ensuring stability. The curve where walls met ceiling received special attention. Rather than creating a sharp right angle, Tormod shaped the top course of stones to create a gradual transition. This distributed weight more effectively and eliminated a stress point where cracks might develop. He observed this principle in Norwegian construction and in natural cave formations, where curved profiles lasted longer than angular ones. By early May, he had completed stone walls for the first 15 feet of horizontal tunnel. The result was striking even to skeptical observers. The passage looked less like a hole in the ground and more like intentional architecture. The stone walls were smooth, the mortar joints neat, the surface solid. Gunnar Holt visited again and stood in the completed section, running his hand along the wall. "I'll admit this is fine stonework," Gunnar said grudgingly. "Wasted on a tunnel, but fine work nonetheless." "Not wasted," Tormod replied. "These walls will be here when my grandchildren are grown." "If you say so, but you've spent 2 months on this project. Your spring planting is behind schedule. Your fields need attention. This tunnel is taking time from work that actually matters." Tormod had anticipated this criticism. "My fields are planted. My cabin is maintained. I work on the tunnel during time others spend resting or visiting. The work gets done." By late May, Tormod had completed 40 feet of tunnel, leaving only the final 10 feet before breakthrough into his existing root cellar. The passage was structurally sound, with stone walls, 3-layer ceiling, and timber frames providing support that would last decades. But as he worked deeper into the earth, he encountered a problem he had anticipated but not yet addressed: air circulation. The tunnel was essentially a dead-end corridor extending 50 feet from his cabin. Air moved sluggishly through the passage, and when Tormod worked at the far end for extended periods, he noticed the atmosphere becoming stale. The problem would worsen once the tunnel was sealed at both ends. Without proper ventilation, the passage would become unusable for extended occupation. Carbon dioxide would accumulate, moisture would condense on walls. The space would become unhealthy within hours. In Norwegian Jordhus construction, this problem was solved using secondary shafts that created air circulation through natural convection. Warm air rose through one shaft, while cool air descended through another, creating continuous flow. Tormod needed to implement a similar system, adapted for Dakota prairie conditions. He designed a solution at a point 20 feet from the cabin entrance, where the tunnel was at its deepest. He excavated a secondary shaft angling upward at 45 degrees. The shaft was 18 inches in diameter, too narrow for anything to enter, but adequate for air movement. He lined it with stones to prevent collapse and extended it until it broke through the surface 30 feet from his cabin. The surface opening was disguised as a natural depression filled with rocks. To casual observers, it appeared to be nothing more than a pile of stones. But between the rocks, Tormod had created gaps that allowed airflow while preventing animals or debris from entering. He constructed a wooden cover that could be adjusted to control ventilation, essentially creating a valve. The physics were elegant. Air entering through the secondary shaft was cooler and denser than air in the tunnel. It flowed downward, entered the passage, and pushed warmer air toward the cabin entrance. The cabin entrance acted as the exhaust point. By adjusting opening sizes at both ends, Tormod could control the rate of air exchange. He tested the system by lighting a small fire in the tunnel and observing smoke movement. The smoke flowed steadily toward the cabin entrance, demonstrating proper circulation. He adjusted the secondary shaft opening until he achieved gentle but continuous flow that would refresh the tunnel atmosphere without creating uncomfortable drafts. Gunnar Holt visited while Tormod was fine-tuning the system. He examined the rock pile, not recognizing its purpose. "Building rock cairns now?" he asked. "Ventilation," Tormod replied. "Air shaft." Gunnar stared at the rocks. "You dug another hole for air?" The tunnel has 2 openings already. Not for living in the passage during cold weather, Tormod explained. Fresh air must circulate, or the space becomes dangerous. Living in the passage? Gunnar's expression shifted from amusement to concern. You're not actually planning to move your family underground, are you? It's for survival, Tormod said. When temperatures drop far enough, the passage will be warmer than the cabin. Gunnar shook his head. This has gone beyond preparation into obsession. You're building an underground house because one winter night was cold. That's not rational. November brought the first serious cold to the Dakota Territory. Temperatures dropped to -15 degrees on the night of November 12, 1880. Cold enough that most families kept fires burning through the darkness. Tormod had completed his tunnel in early October, and the passage now connected his cabin to his root cellar in a smooth, stone-lined corridor that descended 8 feet below the surface at its deepest point. He had installed a door at the cabin entrance to the tunnel, a simple but sturdy construction that sealed the passage from interior cabin air. At the root cellar end, he had broken through the cellar wall and created a connecting doorway. The passage could now be isolated from both cabin and cellar, or opened to either. This flexibility allowed him to manage temperature and airflow according to conditions. On the morning of November 13th, after the cold night, Tormod descended into his tunnel carrying a thermometer he had purchased in town. The instrument was expensive by frontier standards, but essential for understanding what his construction had achieved. He had been tracking temperatures for 3 weeks, recording readings in a small notebook. At the cabin floor level, the thermometer read 41 degrees. Tormod descended the sloped section and walked to the tunnel's midpoint, 25 feet from the cabin and 8 feet below the surface. He held the thermometer steady for 5 minutes, the reading 52 degrees. He continued to the root cellar end and took another reading, 54 degrees. The cellar itself registered 56 degrees. The temperature gradient was clear. The deeper and more isolated from surface conditions, the warmer the space remained. Outside, the morning temperature was -8 degrees. Inside the tunnel system, temperatures ranged from 52 to 56 degrees. The difference was 60 to 64 degrees. Tormod recorded these numbers carefully. Over the next 2 weeks, he took readings morning and evening, tracking how tunnel temperatures responded to surface conditions. When outside temperatures rose to 30 degrees during a mild spell, tunnel temperatures remained between 51 and 55 degrees. When another cold snap dropped surface temperatures to -20 degrees, tunnel temperatures stayed between 50 and 54 degrees. The thermal stability was remarkable. Regardless of surface conditions, the earth surrounding his tunnel maintained nearly constant temperature. The insulating effect of 8 feet of soil was absolute. Heat from the earth's deep interior radiated upward at a constant rate. The tunnel intercepted that heat, creating a space that was naturally climate-controlled. Sigrid began to understand what her husband had built. One evening in late November, with outside temperature at -12 degrees and the cabin struggling to stay warm despite a roaring fire, she descended into the tunnel with Tormod. She wore her heavy coat in the cabin, but removed it halfway down the passage. "It's warmer here than in our house," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Yes," Tormod confirmed, "and it will stay warm even if the cold gets much worse." "How much worse?" "I don't know the limit. In Norway, Jorda's passages stayed comfortable even when surface temperatures dropped to -40 or below." Sigrid stood in the stone-lined tunnel, feeling warmth radiate from the walls. "You built this knowing that temperatures here could reach what killed Eric." "I built this hoping we never need it for that purpose," Tormod replied. "But if we do, it's ready." Friedrich Weiss's uncle, Wilhelm Rasmussen, arrived from Minnesota Territory in early December. Wilhelm was 63 years old, a farmer who had emigrated from Germany 40 years earlier. He had survived winters across the Northern Territories and had developed a reputation for weather prediction based on natural signs and almanac study. His visit to Friedrich's homestead was social, but he brought information that caught Tormod's attention. On the first Sunday after Wilhelm's arrival, he attended services and spoke with the assembled community about weather patterns he had observed. "The almanac predicts a severe winter," Wilhelm told the group gathered outside Reverend Amundsen's cabin. "But more than that, I've seen signs that concern me. The geese migrated 3 weeks early. Oak trees produced exceptional acorn crops. Animal fur is thicker than normal. These indicators, combined with almanac predictions, suggest we may face extreme cold this season." Most people listened politely, but without serious concern. Hard winters were expected on the Dakota prairie. Temperatures of -20 or -30 degrees were common. Everyone had survived such conditions before. Gunnar Holt expressed the general sentiment. "Every winter is hard here, Wilhelm. We appreciate the warning, but we're prepared as we always are. Good firewood, tight cabins, stored food. That's what gets us through." Wilhelm nodded but didn't seem convinced. "I'm not talking about a normal hard winter. The signs point to something exceptional, temperatures that most of you haven't experienced." After the gathering, Wilhelm approached Tormod specifically. The two men spoke in a mixture of English, Norwegian, and German, finding common ground in their immigrant experiences. Wilhelm had heard about Tormod's tunnel and wanted to see it. They rode together to Tormod's homestead, and Wilhelm descended into the passage, examining the construction with careful attention. "This is Hjorta's construction," Wilhelm said, running his hand along the stone walls. "I've seen similar in Norway and Sweden, not common in America." "No one here understands the principle," Tormod replied. "They think I built this to avoid walking outside. But you built it for survival during extreme cold." "Yes." Wilhelm was quiet for a moment, standing in the tunnel and feeling the stable temperature. "I think you may need this more than you expect. The winter coming will test everyone. Your tunnel might save your family." "You really believe the cold will be that severe?" "I've been wrong before," Wilhelm admitted. "But I've also been right. The signs are clearer this year than any I've seen. If I'm correct, temperatures could drop to -50 or below." Tormod felt a chill despite the tunnel's warmth. "That would kill people in their cabins." "Yes, it would. I've spoken with Friedrich about reinforcing his cabin and stockpiling extra firewood. I'm telling others the same. But your tunnel is something different. It's protection that doesn't depend on fire or fuel. If what I fear comes to pass, you'll survive comfortably while others struggle." The conversation stayed with Tormod through December as temperatures gradually dropped. He began adding features to his tunnel that he had considered optional. He brought bedrolls and blankets into the passage, storing them in the root cellar end. He moved additional food supplies underground, more than would normally be kept in a root cellar. He fashioned a small stove from stones that could be used in the tunnel if needed, with a chimney pipe that vented through his secondary air shaft. The first week of December brought temperatures that hovered around -20 degrees, cold enough that most settlers stayed close to their cabins and kept fires burning continuously. Tormod used this early cold snap to test his tunnel system under realistic conditions. He moved blankets and bedrolls into the passage, arranging them in the section nearest the root cellar where temperatures were most stable. He brought down stored water in sealed containers, dried meat, preserved vegetables, and other supplies that would be needed for extended occupation. Sigrid watched these preparations with growing understanding. Her husband wasn't simply accessing the root cellar through an elaborate passage. He was creating a survival shelter that could sustain their family for days or weeks if necessary. She helped organize the supplies, creating storage areas that kept food separate from bedding and ensuring everything was easily accessible in the confined space. Kari and Niels found the tunnel fascinating. To them, it was an adventure, a secret underground room where they could play. Tormod allowed them limited access under supervision, teaching them how to navigate the sloped entrance and walk carefully through the passage. He explained the ventilation shaft, the stone walls, the 3-layer ceiling. He wanted them comfortable in the space so they wouldn't be frightened if circumstances required the family to shelter there. On December 8th, temperatures dropped to negative 32 degrees overnight. The Bjornson cabin, despite a roaring fire that consumed wood at an alarming rate, struggled to maintain 40 degrees inside. Tormod made the decision to move his family into the tunnel for the night. They descended with blankets and settled in the passage section, where his measurements showed the most stable temperature. The experience was revelatory. While the cabin above froze and wind howled across the prairie, the tunnel remained perfectly still and surprisingly comfortable. The thermometer read 53 degrees, warm enough that heavy blankets were adequate for sleeping. The children, initially excited by the novelty, fell asleep quickly. Sigrid lay awake longer, listening to the absolute silence of the underground space. "It's like being inside the earth itself," she whispered to Tormod. "We are inside the earth," he replied quietly. 8 feet down. The earth protects us. They returned to the cabin in the morning when surface temperatures had risen to negative 15 degrees, but the experience had proven what Tormod had built. His tunnel wasn't theoretical protection. It was functional shelter that worked exactly as designed. Word of the Bjornson family spending a night underground spread through the settlement. The reaction was mixed. Some neighbors expressed concern that Tormod was taking his obsession too far, essentially abandoning his cabin for a hole in the ground. Others, particularly those who had struggled to keep their own cabins warm during the negative 32-degree night, asked practical questions about how the tunnel maintained such stable temperature. Gunnar Holt's response was typical of the skeptics. "You slept in a dirt tunnel because your cabin was cold? Why not just build a better fire?" "We burned through 2 days of firewood in one night, trying to keep the cabin warm," Tormod replied. "In the tunnel, we needed no fire at all. That's unnatural. Humans aren't meant to live underground like animals." "Humans are meant to survive," Tormod said simply. "The tunnel allows survival without burning all our wood reserves during one cold night." January 1881 arrived with temperatures that tested even experienced frontier settlers. The month's first week saw readings consistently below negative 30 degrees, with brief warmings that barely reached negative 15. Tormod's family developed a routine that balanced cabin living with tunnel refuge. During daytime hours, when temperatures were relatively moderate, they occupied the cabin. Tormod maintained a small fire for cooking and basic warmth. After dark, when temperatures plunged, the family retreated to the tunnel for sleeping. The arrangement worked efficiently. They consumed far less firewood than families who attempted to heat cabins through entire nights. The tunnel required no fuel, no maintenance, no constant attention. It simply existed at its stable 52 to 54 degrees regardless of surface conditions. Sigrid adapted quickly, organizing their underground space with the same efficiency she brought to cabin management. Bedrolls were stored neatly during daytime and spread out at night. Food supplies were rotated between cellar and tunnel. The space became an extension of their home, rather than an emergency shelter. Other families struggled through January with varying degrees of success. The Rasmussen family, following Wilhelm's advice, had stockpiled exceptional firewood reserves and reinforced their cabins' chinking. They survived comfortably, but burned through wood at rates that concerned them. The Holt family, dismissive of dire weather predictions, found themselves rationing firewood by mid-January. Gunnar made several trips to cut additional wood despite dangerous cold, risking frostbite to maintain his family's fuel supply. Matthias Dietrich's family faced the most serious challenge. Their cabin, built quickly the previous year, had inadequate chinking and a poorly constructed fireplace that lost heat through a badly designed chimney. During the coldest nights, interior temperatures dropped low enough that water froze in buckets. Matthias's wife, Anna, developed a persistent cough from breathing cold air during sleep. Their 3 children slept in a single bed, huddled together for warmth under every blanket the family owned. On January 10th, Matthias swallowed his pride and visited Tormod. The 2 men had never been close, and Matthias had been among the more vocal critics of the tunnel project. But desperation overrode pride. "My family is suffering," Matthias said without preamble. "The cabin can't maintain enough warmth. Anna is sick. The children are cold every night. I need to understand how your tunnel works." Tormod showed him the entire system. They descended into the passage, and Tormod explained the thermal principles, the ventilation design, the construction techniques. Matthias asked detailed questions about excavation depth, wall construction, ceiling layers. He took notes in a small book he had brought. "Could I build something similar?" Matthias asked. "Not before winter ends," Tormod replied honestly. "This took me 6 months, but next summer, yes, I'll help you. And until then?" Tormod considered the question. His tunnel could accommodate additional people if necessary, but inviting another family to share the space created complications. Yet watching neighbors suffer when he had the means to help felt wrong. "If temperatures become truly dangerous, bring your family here," Tormod said. "The passage can shelter more than just us." Matthias nodded slowly, gratitude evident despite his discomfort at accepting charity from a man he had mocked. January 15th, 1881, began with ominous stillness. The wind that had howled across the Dakota prairie for weeks ceased completely. The sky was crystalline clear, stars visible in perfect definition. The temperature at sunrise was -48 degrees and dropping. Tormod recognized the conditions immediately. In Norway, his father had taught him that the most dangerous cold came on clear, windless nights, when heat radiated into space without atmospheric interference. By midday, the temperature had risen only to -39 degrees. Tormod brought his family into the tunnel earlier than usual and made sure their supplies were complete. He carried additional blankets down, along with extra water and food. Sigrid asked no questions. She had learned to trust her husband's weather instincts. At sunset, the thermometer outside the cabin read -51 degrees. Tormod had never seen temperatures that low, even in Norway. He descended into the tunnel and sealed the cabin entrance door behind him. Inside the passage, the temperature held steady at 53 degrees. The contrast was over 100 degrees. Through the night, temperatures continued falling. Tormod made one trip back to the cabin around midnight, wrapping himself completely and moving quickly. He checked the thermometer by lantern light. -59 degrees. He returned to the tunnel immediately, his exposed skin burning despite less than 2 minutes of exposure. At what he estimated was around 3 in the morning, though time was difficult to track underground, he made a final temperature check. The thermometer had reached its lowest marking and stopped, -62 degrees. Beyond that, the instrument couldn't measure. The actual temperature might have been even lower. Inside the tunnel, his family slept peacefully. Carrie and Niels were curled together under blankets. Sigrid breathed slowly and evenly. The stone walls radiated gentle warmth from the earth surrounding them. The air, circulated by Tormod's ventilation system, was fresh and comfortable. They could have been sleeping on a mild spring night, rather than enduring the coldest temperatures ever recorded in the territory. Tormod sat awake, thinking about his neighbors. Families huddled around fires that couldn't possibly maintain adequate heat against such extreme cold. Cabins that leaked heat through gaps in chinking, around door frames, through poorly insulated roofs, children sleeping in clothes, and blankets still shivering. Adults feeding fires constantly, burning through wood supplies, hoping the cold would break before their fuel ran out. He thought about Eric Solberg, dead almost a year now, killed by -40-degree cold while trying to walk 43 steps. Tonight, such a journey would kill in minutes. Tonight, even staying inside standard cabins might not be enough. Dawn came slowly. Tormod ventured to the cabin at first light. The thermometer showed -57 degrees. The cold was breaking slightly, but conditions remained lethal. He returned to the tunnel and waited. His family would stay underground until temperatures rose enough to make surface travel safe. By noon, the temperature had climbed to -41 degrees. By mid-afternoon, -33. The worst had passed. Tormod allowed his family back into the cabin. They had survived the coldest night in Dakota Territory history without hardship, without burning excessive firewood, without fear. The tunnel had performed exactly as he had designed it to. The 24 hours following the -62-degree night became a test of endurance for the entire settlement. Temperatures remained dangerously low throughout January 16th, never rising above -35 degrees. The Bjornson family stayed in the tunnel for the full period, emerging only when conditions moderated on the 17th. The experience revealed both the practicality and limitations of underground refuge. Living in the tunnel required adjustments. The space was confined, 5 feet high and 3 feet wide for most of its length, widening only at the root cellar end. Movement was restricted. The children grew restless by the second day, unaccustomed to such limited space. Sigrid maintained routine through structured activities, storytelling, simple games, quiet tasks that occupied young minds without requiring physical space. Food preparation was minimal. They ate preserved items that required no cooking, dried meat, hard bread, cheese, stored apples. Tormod had brought his small stone stove into the tunnel, but using it risked consuming oxygen faster than the ventilation system could replace it. They managed without fire, finding that cold food was adequate when the surrounding temperature was comfortable. The psychological aspect surprised Tormod. He had anticipated physical comfort in the tunnel, and that expectation was fulfilled. What he hadn't fully considered was the sense of security that came from being completely isolated from the lethal conditions above. There was no wind sound, no drafts, no constant battle to maintain warmth. The tunnel simply existed at its stable temperature, requiring nothing from its occupants except patience. Sigrid expressed this during their second night underground. "In the cabin, even with a good fire, I feel the cold trying to get in. Every gap, every draft, reminds me that we're fighting against something deadly. Here, the cold doesn't exist. We're separate from it entirely." Tormod nodded in the lantern light. "That's what Earth does. It doesn't fight cold. It ignores it." By the morning of January 17th, when they finally emerged, the tunnel had proven its value beyond doubt. They had shelter that required no fuel, no maintenance, no constant vigilance. It protected them absolutely from conditions that had killed people throughout frontier history. The price had been temporary confinement and minor discomfort. That trade seemed remarkably favorable. The cabin, when they returned to it, was bitterly cold inside. Everything that could freeze had frozen. Water in buckets, food that hadn't been stored properly, even the moisture in cracks between logs had formed ice. The structure had survived, but it bore evidence of cold so severe that standard construction couldn't resist it. Tormod started a fire and began the process of warming the space back to habitability, grateful that his family had been elsewhere during the worst of it. Dawn on January 18th brought warmer temperatures, relatively speaking. -22 degrees felt almost mild compared to the preceding days. Tormod ventured outside to assess conditions and check on neighbors. What he discovered would haunt the settlement for years. The Holt family had survived, but barely. Their youngest son, 7-year-old Patrick, had died during the coldest night. The boy had been sleeping near the cabin wall, the furthest point from the fireplace. Despite blankets and his parents' best efforts, the cold had penetrated their structure enough that temperatures near the wall had dropped below survivable levels. The child had simply not awakened in the morning. Gunnar Holt's face when he opened his door to Tormod showed devastation beyond words. The man who had mocked the tunnel project so vigorously now stood in his doorway, hollow-eyed, holding the grief that comes from losing a child you couldn't protect. No words were adequate. Tormod simply gripped Gunnar's shoulder briefly and moved on to check other families. The Rasmussen family had survived intact by crowding into their root cellar during the worst hours. Wilhelm's advice about exceptional wood stores had saved them, but they had suffered severe frostbite. Wilhelm's hands showed the black discoloration that indicated tissue death. He would likely lose fingers. His nephew Friedrich had frostbitten feet from making necessary trips to the woodpile during the extreme cold. The Dietrich family had come desperately close to tragedy. Matthias, following Tormod's earlier invitation, had moved his family to the Bjornson tunnel on the evening of the 16th when their cabin became dangerously cold. They had arrived after dark, Matthias carrying his youngest child, while Anna and the older children stumbled through snow in the darkness. The journey of half a mile in negative 50-degree cold had been terrifying but successful. They had sheltered in the root cellar end of Tormod's tunnel, the two families occupying different sections of the underground system. The arrangement had been cramped but functional. The Dietrich children had survived comfortably while their own cabin, unchecked during the worst cold, had suffered damage. Water buckets had frozen and cracked. Their poorly constructed chimney had developed structural problems from thermal stress. They returned to a home that would require significant repairs. Other families throughout the scattered settlement faced similar situations. Some had survived with minor suffering. Others dealt with frostbite, damaged structures, or depleted fuel supplies. One elderly couple, the Andersons, had both died during the coldest night. Their cabin had been found with the fire dead and both occupants frozen in their bed. By mid-morning, survivors began gathering at Reverend Amundsen's cabin despite the continued cold. The community needed to come together to count their losses and support those who had suffered most. Tormod arrived with Sigrid to find 15 families assembled, more than had ever attended Sunday services. The gathering was somber. Reverend Amundsen led prayers for the dead. Families shared their experiences from the terrible night. Then, without formal announcement, people began turning to Tormod with questions. Matthias Dietrich spoke first, addressing the assembled families directly. Tormod's tunnel saved my family. We would have died in our cabin during the worst cold. Instead, we sheltered underground and survived comfortably. I mocked his construction for months. I was wrong. The simple admission created a shift in the gathering's atmosphere. Gunnar Holt stood slowly, his face still showing the devastation of his loss. He looked at Tormod across the crowded cabin. No words came immediately, but his expression conveyed everything: acknowledgement, regret, gratitude that some families had been saved, even if his own had suffered. "How did you know?" Gunnar finally asked, his voice rough. "How did you know the cold would get that severe?" "I didn't know," Tormod answered honestly. "But I knew it was possible. I had seen such cold in Norway. I knew frontier cabins couldn't protect against it, so I built something that could." Wilhelm Rasmussen, his frost-bitten hands wrapped in cloth, provided technical context. The old country teaches different lessons about cold. In Germany, in Norway, in Sweden, people have built underground shelters for centuries, not because cold there is worse than here, but because they learned over generations what works. Tormod brought that knowledge to Dakota territory. We didn't believe him because we had never needed it before. Reverend Amundsen, who had once questioned whether Tormod's preparation suggested lack of faith, spoke carefully. "Perhaps we have confused self-reliance with divine providence. God provides us with intelligence and knowledge. Tormod used both. That's not faithlessness, that's wisdom." The conversation that followed was unprecedented. Families asked detailed questions about tunnel construction. How deep must one dig? What materials are essential? How long does excavation take? Can existing root cellars be converted? Tormod answered patiently, explaining thermal principles, structural requirements, ventilation needs. Friedrich Weiss took notes, sketching diagrams based on Tormod's descriptions. Other men studied the drawings, calculating labor and materials they would need. The tunnel was no longer Norwegian foolishness. It had become essential infrastructure that might prevent future tragedies. Anna Dietrich approached Sigrid separately. "Thank you for sharing your shelter. You could have refused us." "Tormod would never refuse," Sigrid replied. "He built the tunnel to save lives. Your lives count as much as ours." The gathering ended with Reverend Amundsen organizing a work schedule for spring construction. 7 families committed to building tunnel systems before the next winter. Tormod agreed to provide guidance and assistance to each project. The community that had mocked him for 8 months now sought his expertise desperately. As families departed, Gunnar Holt approached Tormod privately. "I need to learn how to build what you built, not for this winter, but for next. I can't lose another child." Tormod gripped the man's shoulder again, letting the gesture convey what words couldn't. "I'll help you. We'll start as soon as the ground thaws." Spring 1881 arrived late, with frozen ground persisting into April. When excavation finally became possible in early May, 7 families began tunnel projects simultaneously across the settlement. Tormod spent the season traveling between homesteads, teaching principles he had learned in Norway and refined through his own construction. Each project required adaptation to specific site conditions, but the fundamental concepts remained constant. Gunnar Holt's tunnel received Tormod's most careful attention. The 2 men worked side by side for weeks, Gunnar learning through direct participation rather than observation. They selected the site carefully, measuring distance between cabin and existing root cellar. They marked excavation boundaries with stakes and cord. They began digging with Gunnar handling the shovel, while Tormod supervised angles and dimensions. The work was therapeutic for Gunnar. Physical labor provided outlet for grief that still consumed him months after Patrick's death. Tormod understood this without discussion. He had experienced his own grief after Eric's death, and it had driven his obsessive construction. Now Gunnar channeled similar emotions into creating protection his remaining children would need. The teaching process revealed how much knowledge Tormod had accumulated through experience. He explained why tunnel width mattered for air circulation. He demonstrated proper stone selection for wall construction. He showed how to mix clay mortar that would remain flexible through freeze-thaw cycles. He taught the 3-layer sealing system, emphasizing why each layer served specific purposes. Matthias Dietrich's project progressed rapidly because his entire family participated. Anna mixed mortar while Matthias excavated. Their older children hauled stones from the creek. The work became a family endeavor, everyone understanding that their survival might depend on the structure they were building together. Tormod visited weekly, checking structural elements and correcting techniques before problems developed. Friedrich Weiss approached his tunnel with German engineering precision. He documented every step, creating detailed drawings that other families copied. His measurements were exact, his construction methodical. Tormod appreciated the careful approach even when it slowed progress. Friedrich's tunnel would be built correctly, and his documentation would help future builders. The Rasmussen family faced unique challenges. Wilhelm's frostbite had resulted in the loss of 3 fingers, limiting his ability to perform heavy labor. But his sons compensated, doing the physical work while Wilhelm supervised. His weather prediction knowledge had been validated by the terrible winter, giving him authority in the community. When Wilhelm approved construction techniques, others listened. By late summer, all 7 tunnels were complete. Each system reflected its builder's personalities and circumstances, but all incorporated the essential principles: adequate depth below frost line, proper ventilation, 3-layer ceiling construction, stone-lined walls. The settlement had transformed from a community that mocked underground construction to one that considered it essential infrastructure. Tormod held a gathering in September where all the tunnel builders assembled. They shared experiences, discussed challenges they had overcome, and celebrated their collective achievement. The underground passages represented more than physical structures. They embodied a shift in community thinking about preparation and survival. Knowledge from the old country had been integrated with frontier necessity, creating something neither tradition alone would have produced. The settlement was safer, better prepared for whatever winter might bring. Winter 1882 brought another test, though less severe than the previous year. Temperatures dropped to -58 degrees on January 23rd, cold enough to kill but not unprecedented after the -62-degree night everyone remembered. Every family with completed tunnels sheltered underground during the worst cold. Those without tunnels struggled but survived, having learned from the previous year to stockpile exceptional firewood and improve cabin insulation. The difference was stark. Families with tunnels barely noticed the extreme cold beyond the inconvenience of temporary underground living. Families without tunnels endured difficult nights but survived through better preparation. No one died. No children suffered frostbite. The community had adapted, and the adaptation worked. Tormod's original tunnel gained legendary status. It had survived 2 severe winters without maintenance beyond basic cleaning. The stone walls showed no deterioration. The 3-layer ceiling remained perfectly intact. The ventilation system functioned exactly as designed. Other settlers began visiting to examine the construction, treating it as a model for their own projects or future improvements. By 1885, tunnel construction had become standard practice for new homesteaders in the region. When families arrived and began establishing farms, experienced settlers advised them to prioritize tunnel excavation alongside cabin building. The knowledge Tormod had brought from Norway had become integrated into local building traditions, passed from settler to settler as essential frontier wisdom. Gunnar Holt became one of the strongest advocates for underground shelter systems. He taught new arrivals about the cold that had killed his son and how proper preparation could prevent similar tragedies. His advocacy was driven by grief, but tempered by practical experience. He had built his tunnel, used it successfully, and maintained it carefully. His family survived subsequent hard winters without fear. The original settlement grew into a proper town by the 1890s. Streets were laid out, a church built, businesses established. Tormod and Sigrid watched their children grow up in a community that bore the mark of that terrible winter and the innovation it had validated. Kari and Nils, who had slept peacefully in the tunnel during the coldest night in territory history, told their own children about the passage their grandfather had built when others called him foolish. Tormod lived to see his grandchildren. He died in 1913 at age 73, having spent his final decades farming peacefully and maintaining the tunnel that had saved his family. The passage remained functional, used by successive generations who inherited the property. Sigrid passed 5 years later, and both were buried in the town cemetery beside Erik Solberg, whose death had catalyzed everything that followed. The tunnel itself survived into the 1920s before finally being sealed when the property was sold and modern construction replaced the original cabin. But by then, dozens of similar structures existed throughout the region, some still in use, others abandoned but intact. They stood as testament to one man's refusal to accept that frontier dangers were inevitable. Tormod Bjornsson had proven that knowledge, effort, and intelligent preparation could defeat even the most extreme conditions the wilderness offered.